Assalamu alaikum. You are listening to a Ramadan special on mental health and eating disorders as part of the BIMA Health Show with myself, Isma, and Meanha on Ramadan Radio London 87.9 FM, online at ramadanradio.org. Please feel free to call, text, WhatsApp with any feedback, any questions, and any comments. That would be on 077 614 60614. So that is 077 614 60614. So just before we start, just to introduce myself, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Isma. I am a pharmacist who has a keen interest in mental health. And joining me is Meanha, the face of Inspirited Minds. So I don't think I can do justice for her introduction, so I'm going to pass it over to you, Meanha.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair to Ramadan Radio and BIMA Health Share for honouring Inspirited Minds with this kind segment. So my name is Meanha. I've worked in crisis and suicide prevention services for about 6-7 years now. I'm now working in project management. I'm currently head of operations for Inspirited Minds.
Amazing, Jazakallah khair. So obviously, before we begin, although I'm a healthcare professional and so is Meanha, she's a professional in her own right, what we are going to cover does not substitute medical advice. So feel free to obviously leave any questions, general questions and comments, but please do not message regarding any personal health problems. You should be seeing your registered doctor for any personal health issues, especially if you have any concerns. Obviously, this segment is on eating disorders and some of it will be sensitive and maybe triggering for people. So please keep in mind that you can tune in and out anytime. Please don't feel any obligation to listen to the whole segment if you start to feel uncomfortable. So just to start off with, we are running on a very tight schedule. So what a common question people tend to ask initially is, what is mental health? So everyone has mental health. Obviously, we aim for good mental health, but some people's mental health isn't so good. And when it gets to a particular degree, it starts to become more of a mental health problem. And obviously, generally, I think we're all aware that within our community, there is, a general consensus that it is a taboo topic when it comes to mental health, whether that's related to depression, psychosis, the stigma of males, mental health, men seeking help. But obviously, Islamically, I would regard mental health problems to be considered just as important as physical health problems. And one of the mental health conditions that we wanted to focus on today was going to be eating disorders. So you guys might be thinking, why eating disorders? But to be honest, it's not just something that's really neglected in Ramadan, but I think it's one of those topics that's just generally neglected as well. And I think with Ramadan, and when we think about health conditions that may be impacting individuals in Ramadan, we tend to think more about things like diabetes or pregnancy. We don't tend to think about maybe mental health conditions or perhaps something like severe anorexia. So that's why I wanted to shift a little bit of the focus on eating disorders for today's segment. So just to define what an eating disorder is, the NHS description of an eating disorder is a mental health condition where you use the control of food to cope with feelings and other situations. And the most common eating disorders would be anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. So Meanha, I'm going to ask you for a bit of an insight really when it comes to eating disorders. Obviously, in terms of typically, what are the symptoms that you really should be watching out for, signs that perhaps to look out for in other people who perhaps don't have an insight to their condition?
Well, so the signs and symptoms of eating disorders, there are so many, and due to time, I'll mention a couple. But essentially, eating disorders can be broken down into emotional and behavioral signs and symptoms, and then physical signs and symptoms. So emotional/behavioral signs and symptoms, where someone who's struggling with an eating disorder, their attitudes around weight can be, really prominent, can be a primary concern, almost obsessed with the idea of their weight and their body image. constantly preoccupied with food, calorie counting, the amount of nutrients, carbohydrates, sugars, fats that are in foods. And they have really strict restrictions around foods that might not even be intolerance related. So, for example, someone might not be gluten intolerant, but we know that if you cut out gluten and carbohydrates from your diet, you can lose weight rapidly. So someone might, cut out entire food groups, and it might not be intolerance or diet related at all. They can have very, specific and strict rituals around food. So, for example, chewing a certain amount of times before swallowing, eating 5 minutes after everybody else. And a big one, which is very common in eating disorders, is attaching morals to food. So having bad foods, good foods, rewarding foods, good day foods, bad day foods, things like that. Another one is withdrawal from social activities with family and friends where food is involved. Food is a really big one in our Muslim community, mashallah, especially during Ramadan. So actually someone might actively say no or make up excuses to not go somewhere very last minute because they know that there's going to be food in front of them, or they're going to have to eat, or it's going to be weird if they choose not to eat. A lot of people, might choose to forget their wallet, quote unquote, just so that they don't actually have to eat food, and by using not having money to pay for food is sometimes an excuse. A lot of people might say, I've just actually eaten from home, so I'm not going to eat out with you guys. A big one is not eating in front of others, and when they do, it's very little or very large in amount, just to sort of to overcompensate for, so that people don't think that they have an eating disorder, because they can easily say, well, look, I eat lots in front of you. So this sort of like unbalanced approach to food and social activities. Avoiding family meal times is a really big one. So something that's quite common during Ramadan is a lot of people might delay their iftar, or choose to have iftar elsewhere. Often a lot of people use working late as an excuse. Other signs and symptoms might be obsessing with body image, and controlling parts of their life where food and eating is involved. So that's just a few.
Yeah, no, there's quite a lot there that just shows an unhealthy relationship with food in general. And I think even generally, people tend to, without realizing, incorrectly label food as being bad or good, especially as you mentioned, carbs as well. And I think, calorie counting, to some extent, you might be able to sort of pass that off, but obviously obsessively calorie counting when you're, having to count a lettuce leaf, how many calories is in that, or a serving of sauce, then, things are in control there.
And it's really important to sort of look beyond the surface. So physical signs and symptoms is obviously very obvious. So noticeable fluctuations in weight, menstrual irregularities, feeling cold. But there's also other sort of maybe not so explicit physical symptoms. So, for example, a lot of Muslim women who struggle with eating disorders might use modest clothing as an excuse to cover up their rapid loss of weight or their rapid increase of weight. The use of fasting daily. We know that is sunnah to fast Mondays and Thursdays in Islam, so people with eating disorders might use that as an excuse. Another common one is going to the toilet before and after eating, or excessively exercising before going out for a meal or coming back after a meal. Going up and down the stairs more than needed or more than once, for example. I used to work with somebody who used to add hops and skips into her walking just so that she can lose those extra calories. Somebody who's always moving and fidgeting, because a lot of unfortunate sort of anorexic or pro-anorexic websites, they'll encourage people to shake their legs constantly so that their body is constantly working. And sleeping to avoid hunger is a common one as well.
Okay. Thank you for that insight, Meanha. I mean, I'm glad you delved into physical health issues as well, because I was going to say it's not just limited to sort of a mental health condition. It can obviously then lead to things like anemia, vitamin deficiency, menstrual irregularities, hair loss, dry skin, brittle nails, just to kind of cover very brief symptoms in terms of how it can impact you medically as well. Obviously, I was wanted to sort of delve into perhaps what you might deem as to be maybe certain reasons why someone might develop an eating disorder, or certain causes as such. I know that obviously in our community, when you use the word sort of healthy to describe someone, it isn't usually meant in that way. It usually has sort of a negative connotation towards that term. And when you hear things like a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips, those things can be extremely damaging. What would you say is sort of a reason behind why people may develop an unhealthy relationship with food? Where could that stem from, especially within our community?
Sure. So I mean, so for example, there isn't a single, no one can point to one thing and say, yep, this is the root cause of all eating disorders. It can be like, an amalgamation of a lot of things. And it's really important that is to remember it's not just about losing weight. And I was going to cover this when we talk about misconceptions, but I'll talk about it here, inshallah. So it's not just about losing weight and body image. Having an eating disorder is not just about being obsessed with what you're eating and why you're eating it. It can start off, as simple as, oh, I think I want to get a bit more healthier, and then that eventually that can develop into an eating disorder because you become so obsessed with the idea of losing weight, and it takes over all your life. Someone with an eating disorder may start off with going to gym for an hour every day, and then it'll become something that they think about all day, to a point where when they're not at their gym, they're in a very highly anxious state, or they're really distressed. So it can be about control. It can be about, it can be in response to a traumatic or life event. And there's a lot of misconceptions around it being more stigmatized for men as well, because men shouldn't be body conscious apparently, but we know men are there's stereotypes about how men should be built and more masculine, which can lead to unhealthy relationships with food and the gym and taking steroids, for example. Another important thing to remember is why people develop eating disorders is not just about attention seeking. It's about a lot more than that. And another reason could be, ideals that we have in society. And also, I feel like eating disorders are sometimes glamorized. So you don't have to be underweight or, incredibly underweight to have an eating disorder. There's lots of movement at the moment in the eating disorder world about how moving away from the BMI, so that's body mass index, to identify when someone actually has an eating disorder. And like how I mentioned earlier, there's physical, emotional, and symptoms of an eating disorder. BMI is literally just to identify the physical aspect of an eating disorder only. So that's something really important to remember. The causes can be many. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
That's fine. That's really insightful. And I think I wanted to ask you as well, if you know sort of the stats in terms of gender as well, because you mentioned obviously the stigma behind men speaking.
Sure.
Yeah. If you're aware.
According to BEAT, which is Beat Eating Disorders, 1.25 million people in the UK have eating disorders, and 25% of that 1.25 million are males. And I think it was in 2014, it showed that from the previous year there was an 8% rise in inpatient hospital addiction. So in terms of the gender disparity, it's 25% of that 1.25 million in the UK are males, but it is known that it's a lot less represented and undiagnosed in males, purely because that a lot of people see eating disorders as a female only, whereas we know eating disorders do not discriminate against gender. It can impact anyone, any
fair bit, and that would just be those who had kind of had that eating disorder diagnosed. And as you said, obviously men with their mental health conditions aren't as active when it comes to seeking help, unfortunately, compared to women, which will obviously contribute to that factor too. It reminds me of, obviously, I know that Inspirited Minds, I was listening to the podcast that you guys did, I think, a few years ago, with Brother Wajid, and I think he spoke about himself having an eating disorder, and found that extremely insightful on just how that impacted him and what that stemmed from. Because I remember him saying that, some of his friends, they used to make comments about his weight and kind of called him fat as a joke. But that joke was actually a lot deeper than that. It wasn't just something that he could kind of laugh at.
So even though we know anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychological psychiatric disorder, and bulimia and binge eating has really severe medical complications, we know all of this, but actually there's no actual stats out there, no accurate stats for the Muslim community around the world. There's pockets of stats here and there and research. So for example, a study in the United Arab Emirates, I think it was in 2013, found that levels of anorexia in teenage girls in a school was almost double of those in Britain, and it was actually associated to being influenced by sort of Western ideals. So I think there's a huge need for Muslims to be at the forefront of this conversation, because we can no longer say that actually this illness doesn't impact Muslims, because we know it does, and we need to have those stats so that we can provide support for our brothers and sisters.
Absolutely agree with you. I was just going to ask, with regards to stats, is it the same for kind of minority backgrounds, so South Asians? There's still quite limited information, I imagine.
Yeah, so there's still limited information for BAME groups. However, we know that Hispanics have the highest rates of eating disorders. Why that is, I can't tell you. I'm not sure, but I imagine it's got something to do with Western ideals and having the ideal body of a Hispanic woman or a Hispanic man, for example. It's actually quite prevalent in men in Hispanic communities to be, very built, have very structured bodies. So yeah, in terms of stats for BAME groups in Muslim communities, it is still very low.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Meanha. So moving on to, I guess, more of the Ramadan focused. Obviously, basically revolved around food generally. There's a huge focus in Ramadan because obviously the 2 meal times that we have, and even when we're generally having a conversation with someone about Ramadan, we don't tend to talk much about, I guess, how much ibadah we've done or how much Quran we've read. We tend to focus more about things about like what we're going to eat for iftar today, or what we had for suhoor. So obviously the conversation in Ramadan is mainly food based, and even as you mentioned before, there's that social pressure as well around iftar time, because you tend to break your fast with the rest of your family, and even when closing your fast as well, you tend to do that with the rest of your family too. And even pre-COVID, you'd have times where maybe there were iftar parties or iftar gatherings where there's the added pressure of having to eat in front of others, and I can't imagine obviously how difficult that must be for someone with an eating disorder. Is there anything that you wanted to add with regards to how other things that kind of would come into play when it comes to Ramadan for someone who has an eating disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to also remember the individuals who may already be in recovery, and actually not eating for long periods of time can be really triggering for that that person. Ramadan is the perfect